It's so strange, like looking by my screen and me in your screen are reversed, right? Like they're mirror reversed. That's going to throw me off at some point. Good time, like I'm not like driving and trying to do this.
God, if only. That would be a heck of an interview. Just get someone loaded and put them in a car, and then just be like,
exactly.
We'll see what happens.
I feel I'm mildly concerned about how sober I am at this point to actually do this from the original setup. But it's like, you know, I realize I have a reputation and everything, but it's 12:30 in the afternoon. Like even I have to work sometimes.
Yeah, so. No. I have to call the IRS after this, so like.
Right. Yeah.
It's it is what it is. The project has shifted and morphed over time, but you know, it's still just an excuse to talk to people.
Fair cop. Let's do it.
Okay, so we're live. Who are you?
I'm Darren Watts. I'm a game designer. I am the former president and co-owner of Hero Games and Indie Press Revolution. And about 10 years ago, I got out of the owning things business and went back to freelance life. And I've freelanced for a bunch of different people now.
How long have you been? Like you very much predate me, right? I've been around games.
That's the polite way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been around games professionally for, I don't know, 7-8 years now, and I've obviously been a player of games for substantially more. But I feel like you were already a publishing professional before I probably even started playing games.
I got my first ever paid gigs were for Pyramid Magazine for Steve Jackson, back when that was a physical magazine. So that was like the mid 90s. Yeah, okay. It was still around as a published thing into the 90s. Okay. And those were the first things I was ever paid for in games. I didn't start working more or less full time in games until about 2001 or so. Okay, I made real books before that. I worked for a couple of other like traditional publishing companies. So
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Do you still do any of that, or is it all just games at this point?
It is mostly games. I mean, I do a lot of editing gigs, and you know, they kind of tend to be close to each other. I've edited for or I did some proofreading work and stuff for like the Chaosium fiction line, which was kind of, you know, like my first step back into doing some of those.
Sure. Are they still
doing those? But not like the way I used to do it before I got into games in the first place.
Yeah.
So,
and I mean, you know, I have friends who do both. I have friends who both cross over and work in the very specific verticals, and like they are, you know, they're different businesses. And they function very differently. Like you might be a good editor, but like the bureaucratic apparatus of the two are very distinct.
When I was working in publishing, I wasn't even doing that much editing for it. We were actually in like the actual book making process. What I brought to our original company was that I knew how to do print buys and shit like that. Right. Like that was, you know, the main thing that I was like contributing to Hero when we set it up is literally I was the only one who had any experience getting a physical book made. Right. So
it's something that's been really interesting to watch over the past few years for me is the resurgence and interest in like the bookmaking process.
Yeah.
Because I feel like in the core of my introduction, like first game I ever played was Delta Green back when it was just Unspeakable Oath and like a hack of 5e Call of Cthulhu.
Right.
And, you know, through, let's say, like the first iteration of the New World of Darkness stuff in the early mid-aughts. And I feel like a lot of those books, and I still have them, the quality of those texts as physical products is absolute shit.
Yeah.
It's like the graphic novel problem where you're just like, I read it twice and the pages start coming out. And I feel like in the past few years, and this has certainly not been great for my wallet, but I've seen, you know, Smithsonian binding and Cypress binding and like all these things that are known to, say, the rare book market or the high-end collector's book market, making their way into games. And I mean, it's been great. I love it.
Even the quality of print on demand has changed so much in a decade, right?
Yeah.
Like I used to be able to walk through a convention center and be like, that was, done in China. That was done print on demand. That was done just, standing 20 feet away from their booth. You could tell the difference, right? Kind of thing. And it's much harder now. But print on demand looks so much better. The barriers to entry for making a pretty book are astonishingly low for somebody who got into it like I did, just like the kind of crap that we put up with 20, 25 years ago.
It's
not even the same planet.
I'm not going to go so far as to say that like, Lulu or Drive-Thru are producing books that I'm necessarily going to like be thrilled about the quality of. But as someone who has like created a book and just put it up on Drive-Thru and like know that people still have copies of it, it hasn't completely degraded or fallen apart, or like the print is utterly fucked. Like
spine came out the back.
Exactly. Yeah, you like crack it once and the whole thing just falls out. Just like a garbage library textbook. It's been interesting seeing not just the style of game that appeals to people shifting, but the literal production of games becoming a new beast. Okay, so how did you go from, Steve Jackson Games to, eventually running a company as big as Hero Games and then, IPR?
Completely by accident. We were, like I said, this had been a hobby. While I was working in traditional games, I had done, I did game reviews and I wrote magazine articles and I farted around at the very kind of like outskirts of the industry kind of thing for years. And the opportunity came up. I had some friends. This is in the Bay Area in the late 90s. I had some friends who had made stupid amounts of money as programmers. They were, it was the .com boom and they were just had too much money. And they thought it would be a cool thing to buy a game company. And as they were kind of, like knocking that around, I was the person they knew who knew the most about that, right? Like as a business plan. They're like, oh yeah, Darren's our GM sometimes. And, he's had magazine articles published or whatever, right? Like that made me the expert, right? So I was like, oh yeah, that'd be great. And they had all these ideas about the companies that they wanted to buy, et cetera. And I, kind of like talked through their plan and I talked to them out of one of the companies that they wanted to buy because I knew that one had financial problems. And they were like, oh, great. Thank you for helping us with that, for saving us from that. Who do you think we should buy? And I was like, Hero Games has not put out a product in 5 years at that point, right? They still have a website that has thousands and thousands of active people, on there posting every day. I bet if you made a game for them, people would buy it. And then they were like, oh, that's a good idea. That's interesting. I walked away. I didn't hear from them again for 6 months. Right? Just completely lost track of this. I wasn't paying any attention to it. And they came back and they said, okay, we've talked to Hero Games and they're willing to sell to us. So we want you to come work for us. And I was like, oh, okay, sure. Like once again, assuming that this was like a half-assed kind of like joke that we were, oh yeah, we'll get together and in our nights and weekends, we'll put out a book, right? Like that will be awesome. And I loved Hero. I grew up with Hero. I got first edition Hero for my 13th birthday in 1982. I am here for this. This is great. I totally want to do this. So, one of the people who I was so they pay me to go to Gen Con.
Okay.
That summer. This would have been the summer of 2001. And because we were looking for somebody to do the 5th edition manuscript. And I was like, I know 3 or 4 different people who have taken a whack at doing the 5th edition manuscript. And it never worked, right? Like the previous owners just had no money, couldn't pay for it or whatever. And I was like, well, me and Steve Long are friends. I've known him from, the West Coast con circuit and stuff. I know he took a whack at it one time. We should see if he's interested, right? Like we should see if he's willing to do it. And so I took him out to lunch at Gen Con and kind of like told him our plan and said, this is what we're doing. We want to put together and we'd love to buy your manuscript. And by the time I was done selling him on the shit that we wanted to do, he was like, not only do I want to do Fifth Ed for you, but I want to buy in. I want to be a partner, right? For it. So I want to put some cash into this. And we were just like, that's amazing, right? Like we suddenly have like an actual professional who people have heard of, right? Like in our group. This is great. So that gets to happening. And I'm talking to people. We're finding an art director. We're finding all this other stuff while Steve isn't, fixing his manuscript. And I get a call one day from one of the people I was working with. He said, I don't know if you have heard, but your lead money guy of your group, the 5 of us or whatever that were going in on this, just got hauled out of his office in handcuffs by the Secret Service. And you should probably make some calls. Right. So I'm like, holy crap, what the hell happened? Right. Like what's actually going on? And this was the guy who was going to be the president of the company. Right. Like of the company, such as it was. Right. And so we tracked down what's going on. And it turns out this guy had done a bunch of banking software design, right? Like software that banks use to like process their stuff, right? Their transactions. And he had a contract where he was supposed to get paid cash and stock for the work that he had done for creating the software. And he'd gotten his cash, but he was in a dispute with the company over the amount of stock that he was supposed to get, right? Like there was like an interpretation in his contract that was like, if you read it one way, he should have gotten 20,000 shares. And if you read it another way, he should have gotten 50,000 shares, right? Like it was whatever it was, they agreed he had shares. They just didn't agree on the number of them. He had gone out and borrowed a shitload of money for another company unrelated to us. Based on his interpretation of the number of shares that he would have. He was using his number as like up against this loan. Right. And he couldn't get a resolution with the company that he was getting the shares or that was supposed to pay him the shares. And it came time for him to like produce the evidence, right? Like here's, the guy I'm getting the loan from. And I'm using these shares as a back. I don't physically have them, right? Like I haven't resolved my contract problem. So anybody else, facing this situation would have been like, okay, you got to understand, here's the situation. I'm in this other legal dispute and I will, as soon as I have that taken care of, I will come back to you and we'll deal with this loan. Not our hero. Our hero is way more creative than that. He takes the stocks that he does actually have down to Kinko's and photocopies them and changes the numbers on them. And as soon as you've done that, you've committed, securities fraud. And so they arrested him and kicked him out of the country. He was a Canadian citizen. So they put him in jail here. And then as soon as he crossed the border, they let him go because what he'd done was not a crime yet in Canada. Right. Like we arrested him too soon. Right. Like it was, as soon as you put the stock certificate in the photocopier, here, you've committed a crime. In Canada, you haven't committed a crime until somebody does something based on your fake stock certificate, right? Like you can make fake stock certificates all day long, and it's not until you actually try to fool somebody with one that you've committed a crime. So from the Canadian point of view, we arrested him too soon because he hadn't committed the crime yet. So they let him go, but now he can't come back into the United States. He's like exiled in Canada. So without him there, right? Like we're like, okay, well now we're short like a fifth of the money that we were going to have, and we don't have a president anymore. So we had to scramble to, replace him basically and replace his cash. And during that time, I wound up basically as like the next person in charge, and just kind of like the company basically kind of fell in my lap. And this literally happened a week before 9/11. So it was a great time to be out asking people for money for like a frivolous game company kind of thing for this. 9/12 is a great time to go ask people for a bunch of money, kind of thing. But we did, and eventually we put it together and we got our book out by March of 2002. So and it was a surprise hit, and suddenly we were in the game business full time, right? So
how long were you? So I guess how long was the revamped hero in business?
Our version?
Yeah.
The DOJ version? Well, I was in charge of it from late 2001 to 2011, and then Jason, who had been a partner, took over.
Okay.
And he has still, I mean, it's still there as a company. They still put out every few months. They, throw out some like small thing, but it's not Steve isn't there. I'm not there. Hero doesn't have any full-time employees anymore. Right.
But
Jason still owns it.
Jason
Walters from IPR.
Yeah.
Right. Because IPR and DOJ, IPR and Hero were both owned by the same company, right? They're,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So as DOJ, we bought IPR from Brendan Taylor.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I ran that for a couple of years. The last couple of years I was there. And then when Jason replaced me as the boss of DOJ,
sure,
IPR was the side of the business that was working, right? So like that's his full-time gig.
Yeah.
And Hero is just this thing he's got going over on the side. So
well, I honestly didn't even realize Hero was still around.
Like I said, barely, right? Like they haven't put out a book I think Golden Age Champions was the last book that we actually did as a partnership, and that was 2-3 years ago. So
that sounds about right. Yeah. Okay, so something I came in when it was IPR and the big distros, right? And that was it. If you were a hobby shop, you went through ACD or Alliance or like maybe one of the slightly smaller ones. I don't know if like Peachtree or something.
The regional ones, yeah, exactly. They were regional. Most everywhere in the country had one.
Yeah. Or if you set up an independent relationship with IPR, you could get from IPR. And so in addition to the changes in book quality, the changes in book style, right? Like the type of games that are hot at the time. There also seems to have been this change in, I don't know, distro style, right? Like,
yeah.
Even when you could have ordered a game directly from an individual, right? Like early Forge era, you could definitely reach out and be like, "Hey, Vince Baker, you have a direct sale through your website. I can just buy from you."
Absolutely.
But it's with things like Exalted Funeral and stuff like that, where they're like these growing markets, or even big resellers like Noble Knight, that feels new in some way.
Brennan created IPR to solve the problems, or at least try to help solve the problems that indie game companies had with traditional distribution.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it was literally like, I am looking at this problem and here is the thing that we could do. And one of the ways they did it was simply by volume, right?
Yeah.
Was simply by like, IPR, no individual IPR company, but most of the IPR companies, when they started, couldn't get a booth at Gen Con, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was ridiculous. That was a pipe dream, right? But IPR, by smushing 100 indie companies together, got to act like it was a big company, right? Like IPR can buy a booth because you can't buy 100th of a booth, Gen Con, but you can buy one big booth and then get 100th of that booth away from IPR, right? Like you can be one of the titles on the back row there or whatever, right? So, I mean, that was one of the biggest things IPR offered the indie community was the ability to participate by organizing together, right? Like by just, by working as a sales co-op, they got to act like they were a big company and they got to go to the big company things, right? And that was
IPR is a consolidator, right?
Well, it's a sales co-op. So yes, more or less, but there's
Okay.
Philosophically, they would, say they dispute that slightly, but yeah, sure.
Yeah. Functionally, it's a consolidator.
They're far too, hippy dippy to use that word, but yes.
No, totally. And I know Jason lives like out in the middle of fucking nowhere in like some 10-person hippie town, basically.
Yep.
So yeah, no.
Gerlach, Nevada. It's right. It's literally on the outskirts. If you climb to the Fly Geyser at Burning Man, you can see our warehouse. From there, there's a hill that you can climb at Burning Man, and from the top of that hill, you can see our warehouse.
Okay, fair. Get some burners to design a game one year,
dude. The burners are our warehouse staff, or were once again not my company anymore, but they were like we hired year-round burners to come work in the warehouse in the off season for it.
Okay,
And also, they were great. They were good workers, right? So,
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a solid labor pool.
Sure.
Just turns out some of them are kind of
It
way
used
too
to be
spun
when
out.
Burning Man started. There was a gypsum factory.
Okay.
That was like right nearby. That was like the traditional place that like the earliest burners worked when they weren't burning, right?
Sure.
Like when the people who had like gone to Burning Man and somehow never left, right? Like their job would be in this like gypsum like factory, and then that shut down. And so like there weren't that many places, and so like Jason basically would go through and scoop up any like hippies who knew anything about games or whatever, and have them come be in his warehouse for a while. So
you gotta wonder what kind of work culture it produces when like most of your staff are just like completely spun out burners on the off season.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, once again, there's you have to take care of them, right?
Sure.
Like you have to manage the operation. But Jason was very good at doing it. These are his people to start out with. So,
Fair.
Jason speaks burner. Jason's not a burner, but he speaks burner fluently.
Yes. And that's certainly like the couple of times I met him at like Metatopia or whatever, that's like the vibe I've absolutely gotten. Like he seems like a fairly normal dad. But also like a dad who has been around people who are substantially weirder than he is for long enough.
All his life. Before he did this, before he got involved in the game business, he used to run a bike messenger service in San Francisco.
Okay, yeah, fair.
So his job was managing bike messengers, right?
Yeah, like again, another pool of strange individuals.
Exactly, right. So he's always that's always been his culture, his life. And he's really good at it.
Something that I wonder, and it's only really become apparent to me over the past few years of Gen Con. Right, when I went to my first Gen Con, I feel like the IPR booth was like the hot shit. Right? Mm-hmm. Like if I wanted to see something new and exciting, I would go to the IPR booth. And to an extent, there are certain things that like I'm only going to be able to get from IPR, but I find it is more the older school of designers who are still working in new games, right? So the follow-up to Nobilis, right, Glitch, that got kickstarted. Like that is, I believe, the limited edition is only being sold through IPR if you didn't get it on the Kickstarter. Mm-hmm. But more and more, it seems like the indie space, not as like a category, right? I think indie has a specific term, but the small independent creator space, let's call it, is not as enmeshed with IPR. Or even
IPR is not the only choice anymore. Yeah. I mean, IPR for a while was literally what you had if you wanted to be taken seriously. I mean, we used to point to the 2 or 3 companies that outgrew IPR, right? Like we would point to Evil Hat.
Sure.
Or we would point to Bully Pulpit or whatever and be like, see, these guys did it right. This is what you want to do, right? Because it makes us happy when you get big enough to the point that like IPR is not useful for you anymore.
Sure.
Right? Like when they get squeezed out the top of the toothpaste tube there or whatever, that just means there's more stuff coming along behind.
Yeah, that's fantastic. When I can,
and that was the original plan was like, everybody should look at what Fred Hicks is doing. Everybody should look at what Steve Sagadi is doing.
Sure.
And I mean, we're not saying like duplicate them entirely, but like learn what they did and how they did it, right? Now there are so many other ways to get there that it's, IPR is still has value, I think, has a setup, and we've got obviously a bunch of, like loyal publishers who have stuck with us, but they still add 10, 15, 20 new publishers a year. But more and more of them like grow out the top, and like the IPR model doesn't work for them anymore.
Totally.
Right. That's not a failure on IPR's fault. That's a success, right? If you get big enough to outgrow us, then you don't, then awesome. Good. And we'll just replace you with somebody else. Right. So
I feel like the real competitive advantage that IPR, yes, it's great to be able to exhibit at Gen Con or any other booth that like the collective is able to get a booth at, right? But the real benefit had been, and I say this coming from, having been in the retail side of the business for a while, when I'm placing an order, right, I would love to place an order for, 50 units from a friend, right? And sometimes, that is the case. But a lot of times, I'm it's the month and I'm going through and I'm looking, okay, so what does ACD have that's new? And then what does IPR have that's new? But as we move away from the brick and mortar aspect of the business, and I think in the wake of of the reopening, you're probably going to see a boom back of people wanting to go to game stores for a little bit, right? And I think you're already seeing that with things like a big chain is Game and Goat. They have like 30 plus locations across the country, and like their physical sales have absolutely boomed as more locations have opened back up. But the general trend seems to be away from physical retail, right? Or at least as the sales portal, right? I'm much more likely to go online and see what I can order to my house that looks exciting. And it also enables me to get things that aren't necessarily produced in, a run of 1,000, right? I can pick up something that's produced in a run of 10.
Exactly. Yes.
As we move away from, so I guess
I think the retailers who will live in that new environment will be the ones who offer that kind of like bespoke service and say, I know you, Joe, I know what you like. I just saw this thing that only has 10 and I know you should be one of those 10 and let me hook you up with it. Right. Like it's unless they are offering that level of kind of like bespoke service, then I think the retail model is going to struggle, like going forward. Right.
Sure.
So it'll be a question of like who can actually like adapt to the new water, right? So
I mean, and you certainly see that in things like bookstores, right? Like
exactly.
20 years ago, it was the big chain bookstores that dominated, and now it's much more the kind of niche.
Now they're all dead, but like the good indie places are still here and are still, like Tattered Cover is still amazing. And it doesn't even have to be small, right? Like Tattered Cover is still amazing.
Totally.
As a publisher, as a bookstore, I mean, because of all of the services that they provide that no Barnes and Noble or Walden or whatever the fuck else they were supposedly competing with 20 years ago, like that was never an option for them.
I mean, their buyers are also looking in completely different places, right? Like a buyer for B&N might go to the major con or something, and like say the B&N buyer for games, right? They'll put a 10,000 unit order in, and well, that means you have a very limited subset of games because you can only buy from somebody who can provide you 10,000 units.
Right.
And that's, that's generally not going to be, at least for me, the most exciting stuff, but it's also just an inherently narrow subset of the stuff being produced. I guess.
Well, once again, that's what IPR was created to solve that problem originally. And now the environment has caught up with the point. So like IPR is now only one of the possible many ways that you can get your product in the hands of the players who actually want them. That's just that will, I am sure there will be something that will, like be invented in the next 10 years that will solve whatever problem, or will try to solve whatever problem that indie publishers have next, right? Like whatever it is. So.
The suspicion that I have that's growing is what we are really outgrowing is the model of distributors.
Yeah. Well, yes.
Right. And I think when you look at those hyper specific curated experience stores, right? One of the real advantages they have are personal connections with creators at the edges, right?
Yes.
When I go to a bookstore that's deeply exciting, it's not just because they curate a really good collection of whatever thing they do, right? Like my favorite bookstores tend to be, specifically focused on spec fic or specifically focused on historical text, right? But they'll know the publishers, the small house publishers. They'll know specific authors who are producing interesting work. They no longer need to go through distro of any size. And that's what enables them to have such an eclectic and interesting collection that, isn't represented anywhere else. And I'm just wondering, over the years, what has been the shift that you've witnessed in, the successes and failures of traditional distro models, right? And in this example, I might, although it is structured like a co-op and, it is more a consolidator than a proper, distro in the large scale distro sense, I think functionally IPR still fits into this distro model.
Sure. Well, it was built to function in the environment it was born in, right? Yeah. Like, I mean, so if that environment changes, we'll see to what extent IPR itself has to change or grow or, go out of business entirely. I don't know.
Sure.
I mean, I've lived through like two pretty sizable revolutions of this already, right? So I never assume that we're done having those, right? I mean, that something will come through that process. But I mean, when I started in games, there were 8, 10 distributors that were all like competing with each other, that were all kind of more or less the same size, right? Like there wasn't really like a scale differential between them. And Alliance was built out of a merger of several of those. Yes. Right? Like when Alliance came together, it was literally, it's an alliance of these 3 or 4, whatever, original companies. And so Alliance kind of like dominated for years with only like the occasional, like ACD was like, if for whatever reason, if you haven't paid your Alliance bill this month and you really need a book, you can get it through ACD, right? Like whatever, like ACD was just like the alternative of like, my Alliance buyer pissed me off, so I'm going to go work with ACD until they piss me off, and then I'll go back to Alliance, right? And then beyond that, the marketplace became, well, Alliance is great and has everything, but there's also a regional distro who doesn't necessarily have everything, but has many of the things that I want and can get it to me faster because their warehouse is closer to me.
Yeah, totally.
Right, and that's how they will survive. That's the margin that they're operating on. Is I have a actual distribution center in the state that your store is in, and therefore can get you a game a day or two faster that you've got a sale lined up for already.
Right? I mean, hell, even the city, right? Based out of Austin.
And as that model has changed, like even the regional ones now have to like find some other way to compete because Alliance has so many outlets and can get stuff there so fast that they've kind of like overcome the regional advantage even, and are like, it's, well, now there's Alliance, 8 different kinds of Alliance that you can like be with or whatever. And, we merged with Diamond, and now we have all the comic stuff that they can actually like do. I mean, at Alliance has like eaten at some point every version of the alternative to Alliance, right? Yeah. So,
kind of.
If the alternative to Alliance now is like, is bespoke service, well, okay, then we'll see if somebody can like figure out a way to actually make that worthwhile into distribution, because right now people are willing to pay for the difference, right? Like that's the money you save going through distribution is not worth giving up the bespoke service of ordering directly from somebody who knows what they're talking about, right? And or ordering from somebody who is the only place that you can get this thing that they only made 50 of, right? So
you mentioned having seen multiple sea changes in the hobby, and like I've now been around long enough to feel like I've seen at least one while I was in it professionally, and at least I remember the D20 bust as like a player.
Right.
It's always hard to like call these things moving forward, but like if you were to say, okay, I've been watching this space for years, here are the trends I see, here are the things that I'm observing happening right now, like where do you see the potential for another sea change in the next few years?
The print at home quality.
Okay.
At the point where you no longer need to actually like have a physical product delivered anywhere, because the product that you can make with the equipment that literally everybody has at home is just as good, right? Like that's the next, I think, big change for this. When everybody has a high quality printer, everybody has a like really strong POD for this. Everybody has the manufacturing printers, right? Like everybody can like churn out their own minis or whatever, just have them squeeze out of a tube or something, right? Like, when that technology has filtered down to the point where it's commonplace in every household.
Sure.
That will be like, then only, like the IP matters, right? Like then only the actual like quality of like what you designed matters. And, I don't think there's another sea change before we get to that, right? Like I'm sure there will be a lot of little things that like go differently, but when that happens, that's kind of like the next big revolution in retail, right?
Sure.
is like,
I mean, I would argue
I don't have to leave my house to get this.
That might even be the death of games retail, right?
It might be.
If that happens if the quality is there.
It may be the death of games retail in a brick and mortar space, right? Because there will continue to be a need for expertise,
right?
There'll be a need for expertise still, right? Like there's still people will be willing to pay to have somebody paying enough attention to tell them to clue them into the thing that they want, right?
Yeah, the replacement for traditional sales is just influencers.
Yeah, basically.
Wow,
I think
that's bleak.
or not even influencers, because that has such like a lousy connotation, but like the kind of things like the like the Envoy Gateway or whatever, sure. Right? Like that are informing people about the existence of new products, so that you don't have to go to the store, you don't have to get you don't have to get you can have an entire like game like in your hands. You don't have to put on your damn pants to get it. Like you're good, right?
I mean, I think about this a lot with AutoCAD files and 3D printing, right?
Yeah,
the quality's not there, right? It's at least not yet, unless you have a really really high quality additive, or if you pay a lot, subtractive printer. And I've certainly seen those, right? But if you don't need like the super high quality mini to play the game you want, like I can just buy AutoCAD files and a bunch of plastic and make a 2000 point 40K army that's like slightly off brand, but perfectly functional.
Yeah. Right.
Instead of spending.
And I think 20 years from now or whatever it is, you'll be able to make it that's completely on brand. Yeah. I guess is my point, right? Like that's where that will eventually move.
Totally.
Because, 20 years from now, everybody will have a 3D printer in their house. It will just come standard, right? Yeah. Like it'll just be. It'll be like having a fridge, right? It's just like, oh, over here is where I keep my 3D printer, right?
You're
it's
on Zillow and like it has the quality of the 3D printer in the listing.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
God, it'll be an interesting future if that's what actually ends up happening. And I certainly can see it, right?
I think so.
Yeah. Or, like part of having, your office printer and copier is your office 3D printer as well.
Right.
Okay, so where do you see, you mentioned IP briefly, right? And so there's the obvious complication of printed home with IP material. And especially if it's fan made, right? So when I say off-brand, it's not necessarily the quality of the mini is inherently less than 40K minis, though it often is, just because Games Workshop has the production capabilities to make really really high quality resin miniatures.
Right.
But it's also that if I were to say try to produce an AutoCAD that's exactly a Space Marine, it'd be a rights violation.
Exactly right.
And I still think you're absolutely right. There is much strength in IP, right? And I think this has come up recently in a few conversations around independent creators versus small press creators versus probably Wizards of the Coast being the only legitimate big dog in the business, and like the factional infighting. You saw this with the One Ring Kickstarter from Free League dropping during Zine Quest, and like people feeling very mixed about that. What changes if people now, I mean, if basically we move back to what was zine culture of the 70s and 80s, right? Of home produced, small run things that anyone can make because you all have the capabilities to do so. How will that affect, I mean, and this is again an unanswerable question, it's just kind of a thought experiment. How would that affect the dominance of existing IPs and the companies that control them?
Well, if the IP is coming from an outside source, right? Like if you're talking about who's got the Hobbit, who's got Lord of the Rings or whatever, or who's got Star Trek, or who's got, whatever piece of IP has some value or whatever, there will still, I mean, there will still be economies of scale there, right? Like only a company of a certain size is going to like be able to afford to pay the royalties that you need to pay out to, to have the infrastructure to make that happen.
Right? What if we all break the law?
Then I don't think you'll get very far because, at some point that, I mean, we can all break the law when we're dealing with people who aren't any bigger than,
I mean, like think about
Free League or something, right?
The logistics of enforcement, right? Say I make minis.
Oh, I get, dude. It's not the mini companies that's going to be the problem. It'll be the movie company, right?
Yes,
or those are the people who have the money to like have the enforcement, and the enforcement will come top down.
I guess,
right, to the extent
doesn't that just look like the enforcement from like the Napster era of downloads, right? A few people get hit with really really big penalties as almost security theater. like punitive security theater. And for most people, there's absolutely no effect, right? Like, I'm just thinking the logistics of, Warner Brothers, DC, and I make an AutoCAD file that I put up for free that is all the DC characters. And they're, made to spec so that they can be played with a standard game. And I put up a rule book for free that doesn't actually say Batman at any point. It just says dude in dark cape. And I functionally have created a tactical minis role playing game that represents that DC heroes. And I put that shit up, and now people have the production capability to print it all out.
I think you overestimate the effect of I put that shit up, because at the point that becomes something that's capable, there will literally be millions of people who are like trying to put that shit up, and you and your 8 friends will play that game and they'll be fine, and Warner Brothers will never care. Right, like the day that you actually become like an impact on their bottom line, the day that like somebody has enough resources to make a product that is actually kind of like rivaling what Warner Brothers is putting out on their own, keeping in mind that Warner Brothers at this point is literally selling you AutoCAD licenses. Like to make it stuff. The moment you start to like impact the bottom line there for that is the moment they come after you.
See, that's
you're absolutely correct that like as long as it stays on indie pirate scale, then yeah, you're probably right. You probably are safe that way, right? But I don't think.
Say there's 100,000 people. God, I don't even know. That's too big, right? Say there's 50,000 people, 20,000, whatever the expected audience of a DC Heroes game in the modern era would be.
Right.
Okay, so Warner Brothers produces their own. They're inherently going to capture some of the market because it'll be shiny and pretty and use the actual art or whatever. But yeah, okay, so 8 people play one version of a game, but if those are just proliferating left and right, that is a major bottom line problem for Warner Brothers. It's just there's no single target for them to attack. Right?
Sure.
If 10,000 people are playing 1,000 different games, and they're all taking.
I don't think you will find that level of like cohesion. I mean, once again, I might be wrong. I mean but that would be a cultural sea change, as well as kind of like a structural technological sea change, right? Because people want to be playing the same game that everybody else is playing. People want to have that shared experience.
See, that's
right.
That's what I think is suspect, right? And I tie it back to, the changes in distro and limited print runs, right? Like there are a lot of people who are very excited to not be playing the same thing everyone else is playing, right? I think we have moved
I think you're extrapolating from your own circle of like people. I think it's you're overestimating how many people of that there are and the actual impact that they have on on like serious IP discussions, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it is a scale difference. How much money is the one ring going to make?
I have 6 or 8, good friends or whatever who would be considerably happier playing Star Trek, using blades or something, right? Like using some other thing or using somebody's, like wacky homebrew or whatever kind of thing. But most of the people who are playing a licensed game, who are playing something that is coming from an IP that is already controlled from the outside, want to be playing the same game, having the same experience or kind of experience as everybody else across the country. Like playing that same game, right? Like that's part of the appeal of what it is that they're doing.
However many people want to play a red shirts game using, Blades in the Dark, where it's super dicey and whatever, you're going to have, 10, 100x more people who are just playing Star Trek Adventures from Modiphius.
Right, exactly.
No, that's a good point. I do think that is shifting, right? Like the percentages of people. It might. But I think it's shifting very slowly. So it'll and if so long as the big dogs don't do absolutely nothing about it and kind of take preventative measures to keep people in their ecosystem, right? And I think about WotC with
there will always be there'll always be senators or whatever in the pocket of like the major IP producers, right? There will always be a Sonny Bono, right? Like forever. There's no profit in not having one. So
every neat tool that comes around to democratize, well, if it's sufficiently good and a company's paying attention, they'll just build an in-house version, right?
Right. Yeah.
Roll20 brought a ton of people to virtual tabletops, and I have a lot of problems with that product. I think it's just not a very good VTT, but well, what did WotC go ahead and do? They built an inbuilt version, and it's substantially better, and so now people don't even have to go to Roll20 to play 5e online because, well, WotC has their own. And you need to come up with things like that. Yeah, I mean,
and in that case, you're responding to like a major cultural event that drove people to that in the first place, right? Like, would any of this VTT stuff have taken off the way that it did? Would anybody have invested the money that they did if we weren't all stuck in our goddamn apartments all day long anyway, right? Like, so.
I mean,
And that might happen again, right? Like some point in the next 20 years, there may be some other major cultural shift that the industry has to respond to. But those, you can't predict that, right? No. Like that's not, and that's not the way to bet.
Even if you try to predict it, you often mistime it, right? I think about the 3.5 coming out with CDs and like a shitty web tool, right? It's the same basic idea, but they just are way too early for it to actually be something people want.
Right.
So you both respond to the change, but also you need to time it really well.
Right. Yeah. Once again, my game industry experience as a publisher predates PDFs by about 20 minutes. Yeah. Right. Like, I mean, it's, I came from an experience where it's like, oh, that's never going to, nobody's ever going to want that. That's what a ridiculous idea. Why would I put this up online? Why do I need a website at all?
Yeah.
I have all these wonderful stores.
That's Okay. So we've talked about, the business side and the ways it shifted. As a producer, right? What have you seen as shifts in the appetite for different types of games and different types of physical products over the years?
Wow. I mean, like the biggest, the most obvious is the emergence of the narrativist story game, right? Like, I mean, I feel like I've been here pretty much close to the lifetime for that. And once again, obviously, you can always point to like the older predecessor products that like, pointed out the path of like how we got to what we were doing. Obviously, like Amber existed, like before I was getting paid to do anything for games, but I was there when My Life with Master dropped, right? Yeah. Like when I was there, so like I saw that level of like the revolution of narrativism in the games. And I think that that was big enough to like contain the multitudes of like all of the ways that story games went like after that, right? Like once you had kind of like the core cleaving off of like narrativist away from immersionist, what we laughingly call trad role playing, as though like that isn't also brand new, but whatever. Every cleave since then has been smaller than that, right? Has been kind of like subdividing that connection, or occasionally finding ways to like weave things back together, right? Like whenever a major trad property has learned something from like the narrative side, from the story game side, right? Occasionally you will see things like feeding back. It's not like the people making, D&D and Pathfinder and Star Trek and whatever haven't played indie games and don't know like, like what things that they can usefully, fruitfully, swipe back basically. But I don't think there has ever been a single kind of like market cleave like that since say 98 to 2000, 2001, as like when story games came into its own as a genre, right? Like as an actual like it started setting up the rules of being a genre, right?
Yeah, totally.
So
I think about the Patton Oswalt joke of just liking the thing I like and not necessarily liking the way that it, like the predecessor of it. Like I like ice cream, I don't really like rock salt. I like Angelina Jolie, I don't really like John Voight's ballsack.
Right, yeah, exactly, right.
So yeah, I mean there are certainly those predecessors. I guess there are a few things that have felt like a sea change within the design community. And I think in at least one example, there seems to have been a material shift in the type of things being sold, which is, the kind of revival of what we might call the old school style of play, right?
Sure.
You're right, trad is a fairly new category, but as we moved into the 90s and then the early aughts, we did substantially move away from that play style of the 70s and 80s, and then that coming back seems like a change that didn't just affect the design space. It created an entirely not necessarily new product category, but brought back an old product category in a big way.
And repackaged it for a new audience,
totally.
Right? Like there are plenty of OSR players, who literally are reliving their childhood by it's being like, oh yes, this is exactly like playing, Blue Book D&D or whatever. That's awesome.
Yeah.
But there's an enormous number of OSR players who weren't born yet when any of that stuff had happened and have only experienced this style of play within the OSR itself, right? It's they've only kind of like gotten, it's the secondhand version, the second or third time Garage Rock comes back, right?
Yeah.
Like for a new generation, every new generation gets their own, Stray Cats to reintroduce it to them, right? So it's a
wonder what our when we get ska back.
Right, yeah. And you will every 10, 15 years or whatever. You get it again. Every generation needs one, right? So it's a question, like there's that group, I think, has embraced the kind of the difference between when Story Game first cleaved off, a big chunk of like what they were reacting against was what was kind of like derisively termed as crunch, right?
Sure.
Like as like, oh yes, I don't need to have 42 tables for all of this stuff. Exactly, whatever. But Hero, frankly, was part of it at the time, even. Sure. And I think the OSR crowd kind of like understands that, or like sees it, frames it somewhat differently, right? I've talked to a bunch of the people who are in it now. I've written stuff for OSR. I wouldn't say I'm really like a part of the community, but I've enjoyed writing with them. And there's the discussion of kind of like the question of immersion, right? Like the question of to what extent is a good story an emergent property of immersing yourself in a character, as opposed to sitting down at the table with the intention of creating a good story first and inhabiting my character at best second, if not, like beyond that, right?
Sure.
And it's, like where they see the purpose of story at the table and of story concerns at the table. I think the OSR people get that much better than the people that like the story gamers were reacting against to start out with.
Sure.
Right. There was the original trad RPGs, the people that like, story game cleaved off from originally for it, I think were more hurt by the, like by the accusations tossed back at them.
Sure.
Whereas like the OSR people today are just like, oh yeah, sure. This is just this is a personal choice, right? Like which of these do you like better, right? They weren't insulted the way that the original trad people were when the story game people pulled away from them.
It's interesting. I don't think I've ever really thought about it like that, but yeah, that's, as I think about it, that's absolutely something I've seen reflected in like, stories of the time and that people.
Right. Yeah. There's no hurt feelings today like there were really at the time, kind of like between them. And there were a lot at the time. Right. So
I mean, there's always kind of the inherent factionalism, and there are always going to be the individuals who just make an ass of themselves or do really shitty things.
Sure.
And like that stuff occurs. But yeah, this broad sense of betrayal.
I mean, the original Forge were a testy group on purpose, right? Like they intended to be, right? Like they kind of like knew where they stood in like the, in the path of the revolution, right? Kind of thing.
Sure.
They knew what their job was, and part of their job is to, like insult everybody who came before them, right? So it's,
Yeah. Not necessarily my favorite part of any revolution, but usually a pretty necessary one.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's, they played their heel parts well, right? Like,
trying to think if I have any other. I'm certain I have other questions, but I feel like we've touched on most of them. I don't know what do what do you get excited to work on now? Having worked on so much in so many different ways over so many years, like if you were to not need the money anymore and
Right.
just do this purely out of pleasure, you're independently wealthy and you just decide that you're going to keep working on games. Like, what gets you out of
Sure.
bed? What makes you want to keep doing it? Or do you just stop?
I'm not out of dream jobs yet, right? Like
Sure.
there's pieces of there's kinds of games, there's kinds of stuff that I want to do that I have not figured out a way to get paid for yet. So I don't think I would stop until I have figured out a way to get paid somehow for being part of it, right? Like every time I knock off a thing off my list, you know, of like what I would have considered incredibly cool when I was 8, right? Like the high fives to my inner 8-year-old kind of thing. I think when I stop having any of those left, that would be the time that I like stop. I decide maybe it's time to actually retire and like quit doing this. But I have not gotten through, but I did one Star Trek gig, right? Like just to say I did Star Trek, right? Like just to have it on my resume and to be able to say to my inner childhood, dude, you grew up and you wrote a professional thing for Star Trek and you got paid for it. And that was wonderful, right?
Yeah.
I'd do another one if it came along, but I'm not really trying that hard to get any like additional things from them because I got other stuff to do. I have the rest of my list to get down, right? Kind of thing. Doctor Who was the same way. When I first started working for Doctor Who, I was just like, I am doing this just because 12-year-old me would be incredibly pissed if I didn't, right? Like, how do you like not, like take that, right?
Yeah.
Like so there's still a lot. I mean, I'm trying again with the kaiju game, right?
Sure.
Like we did a failed Kickstarter. I learned a bunch from doing it. We've changed systems. We've rearranged our, like internal operation, and I intend to like, get that back up. Maybe by the end of the year or whatever, because kaiju are awesome, right?
Yeah.
Like I want to figure out how to have like the right kind of game to support the kind of kaiju role playing that I want to do, right? I've got 12 more of those behind it, right? Like of like things that I want to hit. So
it's nice.
I just like the experience of it's like this is the kind of storytelling that I want to do. This is the kind of
yeah. It's
I want people at the table doing this.
It's a passion for the process as much as for the end product.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, God knows we make more money doing something else, right? Like that's,
There's
I'm
very
not sure
few people
anymore. I think I'm pretty much unemployable at this point. So it's, this may be the only thing I don't know if I'll ever be allowed to retire because I'm not sure I could do anything else.
Just hit it big once, or maybe win the lotto.
Yeah, right.
or just die before you have a lot of medical bills.
That's
kind of just my plan at this point. Like I don't think I'm going to retire. I don't think I'm going to get rich, but at least if I might be able to die before it gets too expensive.
Yeah, fair.
Okay. Is there anything you want to?
I don't have any kids to pay for or anything, so it's like I don't require. It's not an enormous amount to keep me alive. So
I realized at a very young age that the people who I most wanted to emulate were all my like gay relatives because they had a lot of disposable income.
Right. Yep.
And so I don't. No, thank you, kids.
Right. I can't keep a plant alive. I certainly can be trusted with a child. That's ridiculous.
Yeah. So. Do you want that kid to die?
Like, yeah, right.
If so, give it to me. But otherwise, please keep it away from me. I
say this. I like kids. I like spending time with kids. I just don't want to be responsible for them.
Yeah, I teach.
I'm awesome. Unless somebody puts a kid in my neighborhood, I will, in my immediate area, I will entertain them for quite some time. And then just at about the time they're ready to like start crying or something, I like hand it. I'm done with this one. Give me another. This one's broken. Give me another one.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of thing, which is fabulous. But I couldn't be responsible for that.
I like working with kids. It's just the maintenance of a child.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
Right. They spend too much time being not fun to hang out with.
Exactly.
Right. I want the kids. I just want the fun part. Right. Yeah.
That's it. That's why I'm in games. I just want the fun part.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And we pay the price for that, right? Like that's why nobody pays us anything for it. That's why we have the crap situation that we're in, is because we don't have to. It's, Steve used to joke with that. It's like every day in the morning, as game designers, we get up and say, how can I spend my day helping more people have more fun? right?
Yeah.
That's like a really easy way to face yourself in the morning, right? Like when you're, like in the bathroom looking at yourself in the mirror kind of thing. Just like, all right, well, like my job is still, like making people have more fun. Steve used to have on his desk, he had like a wooden sign that was he had made for him. That was like carved and really fancy and nice. And he, like looked at it every day because it said, do you really want to go back to practicing law? And he's just like, no, I don't. You're right. Absolutely. Back to the grind, back to the typing. And then he'd start typing like Kermit, kind of thing.
Just anything to not have to go back to law.
Right. Yeah. Which, and he took a 2/3 pay cut to come work for us at Hero, at least for it. And, and by now it would be way more than that even. But,
Certainly.
So.
Well, here's to maybe not making the most money, but having a decent time doing it.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. All right.
That's the plan.
I think I'm done. I mean, we're literally in 5 seconds. It will be an hour.
Okay.
Do you have anything you want to hawk? Do you have anything you want to pitch? Do you have anyone you want to?
I want to hawk. I want to hawk my new podcast. That's what I want to hawk.
You have a pod?
I do, in fact, have a podcast. It has nothing to do with games, unfortunately. It's all about comics. It's my other thing. So it's called Explain This, Comics Guys.
Okay.
And every other week, me and Steve Tasker sit down and we take on like a topic about comics and we explain it to you. Whether it's, like the history of a company, why companies are the way they are, why comic stories are told the way they are, characters who have really like problematic or complicated backstories about like why they're so fucked up or whatever. Sure. We literally just did the last 2 episodes were a 2-part history of Image Comics from 1990 to today, basically.
The bunch of creators getting together and all the independent imprints they created under Image. And
yeah, well, we've done Marvel, DC, and Image so far.
Okay.
And now that we're like through those, we're like, okay, now we're going to hit some of like the other big indies, basically. The problem that we've had with
Malibu.
Oh, totally. Well, Malibu was a big chunk of the Image one. We talked about Malibu all through it. So
okay,
yeah.
Nice.
But we're like starting with the ones that succeeded, right? Like it's like the problem that we have is that all of the stories that we have to this point have had a happy ending, right? The happy ending is, and then they made a bunch of money and became a big company and whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so like I can't wait till we get to the ones that failed, right? Like when I want to tell the Kamiko story, right? Like I want to tell the Tundra story. I want to tell like the ones, that are like thoroughly messed up.
Yeah, just deep horror stories.
Right. Most of that we've hit because we also do individual creators ones, right? Because we've like talked about Jack Kirby. Sure. Actually, this weekend we're recording Steve Ditko.
Nice.
So we've got a bunch of
and what's it called again?
It's called Explain This, Comics Guys. Okay. It's on all the services. We have a Podbean. It's explainthis.podbean.com.
Okay.
And it goes up every other Wednesday. And we've done I don't know 20 something of them at this point. So it's
I'll be subscribing after this call.
Please, we'll set you up.
Yeah, so. I'll give you that good old 5-star.
There you go.
All right, man. Well, thank you for coming on. It is, as always, good to see you. I hope to run into you at like this.
Absolutely, I was gonna say we'll be out in force at some point here.
Yeah,
we're looking. The Double Exposure has kind of like has bet pretty heavily that we'll be back doing cons by the fall. Right, like they've pretty much bought into the delayed Origins idea, and we are fully planning to do Metatopia in person. We're not sure what Gen Con is going to look like. We aren't 100% sold on that, but
I think we'll get
that is obviously dead. But
I think we'll get a 2022 Gen Con. I don't think we're getting a 2021 Gen Con.
Yeah, I'm not sure we will either.
Yeah.
But the Origins in October thing looks entirely plausible, and right now at least we're kind of like taking that seriously as a thing. So
yeah, and maybe PAX Unplugged in November.
Right, exactly. Well, and Metatopia would be in November as well. So that's I think kind of like the plausible time frame that enough people will be vaccinated, enough crap will have gone on. I just got my first shot literally 2 days ago, Tuesday. So
nice. Congrats.
Thank you. Yeah. So I get back in 3 weeks for my second one. So
yeah, that's where I'm at. I got my first at the Javits Center last week.
Oh, there you go. I went out to York because I was tired of trying to deal with the Javits. Javits is a nightmare. Whatever.
Yeah, I was in line for like
where my
3
wife
hours.
is going. But yeah, no, screw that noise. I did like there was a service I did, so I did the state one that's out at your college in Queens.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, as always, good seeing you.
Absolutely, a delight, and let me know when this is up and around. I'll promote it on all my socials here.
I'll tag you when it goes live.
Fabu.
All right, dude. Talk to you later.
All right, have the fun.